Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And, if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you can take us wherever you want to go on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you will find the Lunch Hour. If you are listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, you can check out what's happening in studio by taking a look at our YouTube channel. Please smash down as aggressively as possible on that like button, that subscribe button, leave a comment, send us a note, and let your friends and family members' friends know how much you are enjoying the Lunch Hour. Very excited to bring our guest on today. Her name is Jennifer Huddleston. She is a senior fellow in technology policy at the Cato Institute. Her research focuses on the intersection of emerging technology and law, with a particular interest in the interactions between technology and the administrative state, something very near and dear to my heart. Huddleston's work covers topics including antitrust, online content moderation, data privacy, and the benefits of technology and innovation. Her work has appeared in USA Today, National Review, the Chicago Tribune, Slate Real Clear Policy, and U.S. News and World Report. She is published in law journals, including the Berkeley Technology Law Journal and George Mason Law Review. She has a JD from the University of Alabama School of Law and a BA in political science from Wellesley. I can't think of two more distinct and divergent campuses than the University of Alabama and Wellesley. But Jennifer, we may get into that towards the end of the show. Let's start here with this intersection of technology and the administrative state. Why aren't we doing more to use tech to make it easier for people to comply with regulations that they need to deal with? I mean, it's a curveball question and not at all what we were going to focus on, but because we're talking about this intersection, why can't I go and plug in a few key pieces of information about my small business in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, the number of employees that I have, and have somebody spit out all of the paperwork I need to do to comply with federal regulations?
Well, I think we can be optimistic and hope that in some ways that day may soon be coming. That's actually one of the real advantages of some of the potential applications of things like AI, particularly these direct to consumer products that we're seeing and some of the applications that we're seeing built on these various AI models. There could be this real democratizing effect where if you're a small business or you're an entrepreneur thinking about launching a business, that you'll be able to use technological tools to help you figure out, are there barriers? Are there questions you need to know? Or maybe you hear about a piece of news on a podcast like yours or see a headline and you go to, Google's Gemini or to ChatGPT and say, if I'm a business owner, can you tell me, whether or not my business is likely to fall under this? You don't take that as a sure answer. You still have accountants and lawyers and things like that. But it kind of gives you a kind of starting point to perhaps consider that in a way that previously to just kind of get that first glance review would have been really time consuming or really expensive. So I think that this is actually an example of one of the potential positive applications we're seeing of technology emerging right now. And if you even think about this, a generation of technology back, what we're thinking about right now with the internet, how much easier it is to find out the information around what it takes to start a business or to start a business because the internet has lowered those barriers versus, when you would have had to go to the local town hall, stand in line, fill out a bunch of forms, not be sure, then have to go to the library and cross-reference. Did you properly do this form and things like that? So I think there really is this, quite frankly, democratizing element of technology that we often forget about.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, when we talk about the intricacies of the regulatory state, the idea that, anybody can go, when I was teaching on the regulatory process, one of the first things I would have my students do is go to regulations.gov, and they would go and have them. They had to pull up one rulemaking that had come open in the previous week and one that was coming closed in the coming week. And the idea was to give them a sense as to the breadth of everything that our federal government was involved in, but also, this idea of being able to comment on these things and offer up their opinion. There was something very empowering about that. So if you wanted to send a comment on the drawbridge opening and closing schedules on the intercoastal waterway, or the impact of rules governing the Eastern Range flying squirrel. And I know I'm making that one up. But you could do that. That's so important that we can do these things. And I think that it's especially true nowadays. In fact, let's talk about this, because you just filed comments in an information collection request on data privacy, didn't you?
Right. And this is something that we continue to see be a debate. If you look broadly, the vast majority of Americans agree that there should be a federal data privacy standard. But of course, there's a lot of disagreement about what that standard is, in part because while we all agree that privacy is a value, it's a value that often comes into friction with other values. So we have tensions at times between privacy and speech. We have tensions between privacy and innovation. We have tensions between privacy and these beneficial uses of data that many of us enjoy. And so the question becomes, how do we ensure that individuals are making the choices that reflect their own preferences? Because we probably all have different preferences when it comes to data privacy, and different preferences even in what we'll state are our preferences and what we actually reveal in our actions around, do we use ad blockers? Do we engage in kind of incognito modes? Do we actually rather have that 30% off coupon in exchange for our email address or phone number? These are all choices that we're making on a day-to-day basis. And what we don't want is a world where only that most restrictive privacy option is available, because there are a lot of beneficial uses of data, both for us as consumers and being able to have more information about the products and goods that may serve us, have discounts that maybe are tailored to our actual interest and buying habits, have environments online that focus on the things that we enjoy and the type of content that we want to interact with rather than the type of content that we don't, as well as real advantages when you think outside of the kind of traditional social media and internet space. The way that we're seeing data revolutionize fields like agriculture, revolutionize things like medicine, in order to better serve a very specific need in those industries, to better serve a very particular individual's, for example, medical need. All of these things can be impacted by data privacy laws, even if they're areas where we already have existing data privacy on the books.
Is it as simple as the idea? And I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a colleague on a radio station I was hosting on a couple of years back, who found it astounding that people were willing to submit DNA to a website and paying for the privilege of doing so. Whereas if the government mandated this, obviously they would be concerned about this. Is it as simple as, if you're giving information that you would be uncomfortable or concerned about giving the government to under force, that you, obviously I'm not saying we need a regulatory regime for this. What I'm saying is that if you wouldn't want to give it to the government for force, maybe perhaps you shouldn't pay to give the money to somebody, or pay to give that information to somebody. I don't know. Maybe I'm muchly is not even a word. I'm vastly oversimplifying it, but your thoughts here.
Actually, I think it's a lot more complicated than that, because I think there's a big distinction there. When we see that there are elements of government involvement, there's not really that element of choice anymore. That's why we have such strong Fourth Amendment rights. That's why it's so important that we actually have conversations around when, if, the government or law enforcement goes to one of these companies, do they have to hand over that DNA? What kind of warrant requirements, what kind of request requirements? Versus if I'm an individual, I can look at the different privacy policies. I can say, I trust, DuckDuckGo more than Google, and so I'm more willing to give them my data. Or I can say, I read 23andMe versus Ancestry.com's privacy policy. I am comfortable making this decision for me. The trade-off there is potentially worth it. And as an individual, if I don't like that privacy policy, then I can go to a different company. If I don't find it to be beneficial, I can choose not to engage in that. Versus when we're talking about the government, there's usually not that element of choice anymore. There's certain elements of data that you are required to give the government. And I think one of the kind of interesting areas of tension that we are seeing, particularly after a case called Carpenter that had to do with cell phone location information and what degree of requirements were there on the government to get that information, what reasonable expectation of privacy did consumers have in that information? Is how does this apply more broadly? What do we see in terms of what are the ways that government can buy data, or what are the ways that they can put pressure on companies? Do we need more formal statements around kind of the rights of individuals, the rights that companies may have to protect the individuals that they've made certain privacy promises to, so that there's this certainty that, if you just get a request, you can say kind of come back with a warrant, type of situation.
No, it's and I appreciate, obviously it's a standard that's derived from the law. It's a good entree also now into these other kinds of policies that are being discussed, right? The debate over protecting kids online and the various approaches to this. Let's talk about the issue of things like COSA, the Kids Online Safety Act. As you know, I've spent a good chunk of time talking to our colleague, Jessica Malugin at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, talked a little bit about this with Adam Thier from the R Street Institute. Where are you in all of this and the promises or the concerns, the perils? Where do you come down?
Before I went into public policy, I also taught 4th and 6th grade math in the rural Mississippi Delta and at a charter school in Houston, Texas. So wow. I say this as someone who has, interacted with the age group that a lot of times we're talking about in this case. Now, this was a decade ago, and the internet and social media were very different in that day and age than they are today. I'm not going to pretend to know everything. But what I will also say, both from my experience as a teacher, as well as, friends of mine that have children that age, every child and every situation is different. Right. And the problem with a policy approach is we're assuming a one-size-fits-all solution to something that has very different nuances and very different trade-offs, not only for each family, but often for each child within each family. And so when we ask about, we want to keep kids safe online, if you talk to parents, if you talk to teachers, if you talk to other adults who are in children's lives, what they mean by that is going to vary a lot. For some, it's concerns about how much time a child is spending on a device, which may be a conversation that's broader than just the time on the device. Are you struggling with making friends? Do you not have the type of spaces where you can run around and play? Are there other trade-offs involved there? For some families, it's the concerns about very specific exposure to very specific types of content that they feel go against their values, or concerns around what they see as the cultural influences online more generally. For others, it's still that kind of traditional late 1990s, early 2000s concerns about, more predatory behavior, bad actors online, targeting young children to do nefarious activities. All of those are going to have very different solutions, and oftentimes are going to have conflicts even within the same family. Not to mention that this doesn't take into account that there are many cases where online spaces can actually be beneficial for young people, whether it's for educational opportunities, whether it's for developing some sort of business online, whether it's that they feel isolated, that they feel like they're the only kid who likes the thing they do, and they go online and they find, a community that's obsessed with the same book or the same game or the same TV show, and they feel more included than they do at their school. There certainly can be a lot of opportunities for beneficial actions online, that we shouldn't just presume that every interaction is going to be a negative interaction.
Let's pull that back to the 30,000 foot level, because I think you've underscored something that is a general issue in public policy, which is we all have a sense of what a problem might be. But if we can't agree on what that problem is, then we certainly won't be able to agree on a solution to that problem, because we can't agree on what the problem is. And then therefore, maybe we shouldn't be proffering some kind of statutory or regulatory solution. And I use that as in air quotes, even though I'm not using air quotes, a solution to that problem. But sort of as a general rule, maybe if we can't agree on a particular public policy problem, maybe we should at that point sort of take a step back and say, something, let's see how, let's let what spontaneous order, step in here and figure out a solution.
I think that this is something we see time and time again when we're talking about the internet and when we're talking about internet policy. We were talking about privacy a minute ago. This is one of the problems in data privacy too. In general, there's an agreement that there should be a federal data privacy framework. Basically, once you get past that there's an agreement that a federal data privacy framework is preferable to a state by state approach. That's kind of where the agreement ends on that kind of issue. Similarly, on the youth online safety issues, as I mentioned, the kind of what do you even mean by that problem is often very diverse within this conversation. I think this, though, does lead to one of the kind of underappreciated policy tools that we forget about, which is education over regulation. Are there ways to empower young people and parents to know what tools are out there, to know what they should do if they are having a hard time online, if they encounter a problem, the way that, we encourage media literacy in general? Are we updating the way that we talk to young people about technology, about devices, so that we're making sure that they're able to make choices, and so that if they do have a bad experience, that they know what to do in those cases. They know who to come to. They know how to, whether it's reporting it to a platform itself or talking to their parents about what they've seen. Conversations that we were having, when the internet was first coming about, but maybe need to be updated a little bit for the conversations that we're having today around smartphones.
Right. It's funny because you were talking about this and having, work with students however many years ago that it was, and the internet being very different. I mean, in some ways it certainly was much more of an unrestricted, unregulated world that's out there. But the challenges are always there. Let's talk about the Kids Online Safety Act. One of the problems that Jessica Malugin and others have raised is the issue of sort of the database that gets created of identification and the problems, the perils, the risks therein. What are your thoughts here?
I think when we're talking about age verification, whether it's in this bill or in any bill, because we've seen state bills as well that would require age verification, it's important to remember that age verification for everyone under whatever age, whether it's 14, 16, 18, is also going to be age verification for everyone over that certain age. There's no way to know that someone's not under 18 without proving that they're over 18. So if you're an adult user of the internet, these laws would impact you as well. And I think when we start to think about adult users particularly, we can all think of there are times when that anonymity is critically important and at times even important to keeping people very safe. Whether it's a woman who's trying to escape an abusive relationship, whether it's a political dissident who's trying to connect from the other side of the world to an American journalist to tell what's going on in their country, that kind of anonymity can be literally life-saving at times. It's not just about being able to go online to enjoy a video game or whatever. And so that's something that would be at risk under these age verification laws, because in order to buy a device or in order to get on a platform, depending on the specific law in question, you would have to show who you are. And that could be a barrier to some of these very specific communities. Then, as you mentioned, there's the data security and data privacy question of if you're being required by the government to upload birthdays, addresses, photo verification, various things to a database, you run the risk that that database becomes very attractive to certain types of bad actors, whether it's people trying to find certain communities or whether it's people trying to harm young people. You can think of various worst case scenarios, and you can also think about why that would be an extreme deterrent to an opportunity for speech. People who don't want to have that level of detail about them in a database that could be accessed by the government, could be accessed by bad actors, may then lose those opportunities for speech. And that's why it raises these privacy and First Amendment concerns, not only for the young people that could be impacted, but for adult users as well.
Right. The idea of let's create a massive database of contact information for underage kids. What could possibly go wrong with that out there? let's sort of turn our attention a little elsewhere, though, because you're spending a lot of time as we're recording this week talking about the antitrust trial against Meta. Where noodle through with us. Help us figure out what's going on with Meta and the trial and the circumstances. Tell us about it.
So we've seen under both the previous Trump administration and the Biden administration a significant amount of antitrust cases brought against some of America's leading tech companies. The Meta case is one example of that, and it really focuses on Meta's acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp, things that occurred over a decade ago at this point. And the FTC is basically trying to argue that because of these acquisitions, consumers don't have as good of an internet as they would. That Meta used these acquisitions to quash potential competition. But the problem with this approach is it assumes a certain amount of business development from Instagram and WhatsApp in a counterfactual world that we don't know would have existed or how it would have played out. It assumes certain changes would or would not have occurred about the internet, about users, about these platforms themselves in a way that we can never know.
Well, I'm going to interrupt you. I mean, it was just one of these things. I mean, imagine if Meta hadn't purchased WhatsApp. I mean, the idea that I just find it astounding that we wouldn't be able to develop a sort of an alternative text-based communication system that lots of government employees would wind up using to communicate very sensitive. Oh, wait a minute. We did have that even with Meta owning WhatsApp. There's Signal, there's Telegram, there's whatever else that's out there. I mean, obviously TikTok is the other thing. And it seems to me that the concern about TikTok really undercuts the approach that somehow Instagram and Meta's acquisition of Instagram has created a marketplace where innovation and competition doesn't occur.
Well, and, if you talk to any teenager or any Gen Z or, young adult or whatever, and you ask them to name their most popular social media apps, you're probably going to get things like TikTok, Snapchat, WhatsApp, Be Real, Signal, Telegram, a lot of different apps that are going to be slightly different than the ones that, millennials are on or Gen X is on, that we're seeing this market continue to evolve and change. And one of the other really interesting and concerning things in the FTC case against Meta is how they try to define this market, which they just call personal social media market. So they say it doesn't include TikTok and Snapchat. They say it doesn't include, a lot of these messaging apps that we see being cross-used versus WhatsApp for messaging. It really tries to define this very, very narrowly. That doesn't seem to reflect the market. That if you just went out to your average consumer and said, tell me what messaging apps are available. Yeah, they might name WhatsApp, but they're probably also going to name iMessage and Google Chat and Signal or, GroupMe or something else. Similarly with social media, if you said name 4 social media apps, even if you tried to say name 4 visual forward social media apps, particularly to a younger generation, yeah, Instagram would be in the mix, but they'd name several other apps as well. What's also really interesting and concerning about this case is the risk of what happens if the government succeeds. Because part of this is saying, Meta at the time took what was considered a big risk. It was joked about on late night television. Nobody could believe that Facebook spent this much money to acquire this photo app that, was still really small and largely at that point. It was, joked about on the Daily Show. And similarly with WhatsApp, there was a lot of business kind of question around, why are you spending all this money on this encrypted messaging service? And it turned out to be pretty good bets for them. These were apps that they found were popular. They were able to invest in certain product features that were different than their main product. Does this then send a message to the business community to be careful about taking those big bets, to be careful about taking those risks? Because if they pay off, that the government may come after the fact a decade later and raise new questions, even if they were approved initially.
Well, right. I mean, is this one of these situations in which the FTC was, they had an ideological goal in mind and then tried to sort of is cobbling the law to fit that goal?
As I mentioned, it's important to remember that these mergers were initially approved by the FTC at the
Yeah.
time that the transactions occur. It's been with all of the tech cases, they seem to be based in some of the animosity or anger or frustration towards these successful tech companies in general. And what we've seen is that there's this real risk with antitrust enforcement that it's starting to be used for policy goals rather than for competition goals.
Right.
Whether that's used as a tool to go after certain industries that are politically disfavored, or one of the concerns, particularly with the Meta case, is that we've heard a lot of talks around content moderation as potentially an issue there, which, of course, one of the issues is even if you split up Instagram and Facebook, there's no guarantee that you would have any kind of different content moderation.
Right.
And in fact, similarly, concerns about data usage or concerns about privacy might actually get worse with two separate companies, but you'd have fewer resources.
It's so funny because my concerns with, I mean, obviously I get concerned with content moderation, but set all of that aside for a moment. My concern is, with companies that get vast, and again, I don't think that there's a government solution to this, except, stick with me for a second here. I'm going to get complicated. If I pay Facebook, Meta, to promote a particular piece of content, I want to be able to verify that content has been promoted, right? And right now there's no way to do it. And I'm not saying that there's a government solution. I'm not saying that the FTC needs to investigate this. I wish there was a better way for me to, like, if I go and I buy a bunch of billboards, I can go out and see the billboards. Or if I buy radio ads, I know that I can see that. With Facebook, it's always been a little sketchy to me. And there's no, I can't talk to a live person. But, again, I don't think that there's a government solution that's involved in this. I don't want the government to sit here and mandate that Facebook has to go and hire a bunch of people to answer phones, or, God forbid, they have to create some kind of AI bot that I need to talk to, because Lord knows that'll just drive me up the wall. But in terms of this, I mean, obviously the FTC is supposed to be out there ensuring that fraud doesn't occur. That's obviously not the issue here, though, is it?
I don't think there's an issue of fraud here. And I think, to your point, there's actually is a really good point in the difference between things that are government mandates and things that are best practices. So we can say it's a best practice for a company to be rather transparent with its customer around how its advertising works, around how it uses data, around how it engages in content moderation. As a best practice, that's what many consumers want. That's what many advertisers want. But when you start to mandate those things, you have different issues. You both have issues of compelled speech in some cases. You have issues around what does that do, because it may lock in kind of current systems versus allowing that natural evolution. And you also have the issue of, when you start having government mandates, are you actually providing a roadmap to the loopholes in some of these rules? Because you make it more difficult to update them. You require that certain things be disclosed, and then the bad actors kind of go through and say, but if I put an exclamation mark instead of an I, it won't get caught on content moderation. And they have a 6-month requirement to be able to update this. So I can at least get 6 months before they update to, or otherwise kind of in their content moderation rule. So I think this really highlights that tension. There are things that we can say we think are best practices. We're going to choose to use companies that engage in these practices because they're what we want as a consumer, and see market forces driving certain actions that way. And then and that is completely distinct to me from kind of the government intervention side. And I think we do see this in certain areas, including the youth online safety area. We've seen a lot of parents really demand other options, other tools, so that they can help their children use the internet safely. And we see both existing platforms responding, as well as new tools like non-smartphone, old-fashioned flip phones for kids kind of coming back more as an option, having different levels of parental control software, from the accessing the internet itself all the way down to, these parental control features on individual devices that are not because of a government mandate, but are because of what we're seeing that consumers want in the market.
Let's turn our attention back to the AI issue, because obviously, as we talk about, the sort of the way we regulate the internet, we regulate safety. There's also talks about deep and abiding concerns. As I said to Adam Thier a couple of weeks ago, obviously, I don't want artificially sentient robotic dogs with flamethrowers on their backs. That's sort of where I draw the line here. But obviously, well short of this, there are folks who have deep and abiding concerns with AI. Let's talk about, and I think you probably agree with Adam, at least to some small measure, about the concept of permissionless innovation. Let's talk about the importance herein about getting this AI question right.
Getting the AI question right is important in a few different ways. The first of which is the US got the internet question largely right. We saw in the mid-90s a lot of statements that basically said, look, the government's going to presume that this is free for innovation unless we see a very specific problem, and then we'll respond to that specific problem. That really allowed innovation and entrepreneurship to be unleashed in the US in a way that was very distinct from what we saw in Europe, which took a much more like, no, if you want to do something, you have to come ask for government permission first. Right. Now we're at that same moment with AI, and there's a similar tension. We're seeing places like Europe have a much more restrictive approach, an approach that seems to be requiring government permission first. We're still trying to fully realize what the U.S. approach is going to be and whether the U.S. will continue that tradition that has really allowed innovation to lead. I think it's also important to remember that when a new technology comes about, all of our existing laws didn't just disappear. So if your concerns are about things like fraud, if your concerns are about things like discrimination, there are existing laws on the books. At times, the courts or legislatures will have to clarify how those apply to a new technology, but many of the harms are likely already addressed by those existing laws. And on those cases where they're not, or there are specific harms, that's where we maybe need to have a greater conversation. But I also think it's really important that we consider the benefits of AI innovation. We hear a lot about the doom and gloom, whether it's, sentient dogs with flamethrowers, or whether it's the idea that, the chatbots will replace everyone's jobs or things like that. But there are a lot of really exciting applications, particularly in fields like medicine, where you're seeing things like stroke victims being able to communicate better, where you're seeing the ability to identify treatments for cancer. When you're looking at natural disasters and being able to route resources to the right place more clearly, or even send out earlier warnings if something's going to potentially happen. These are all things that I think should be very exciting to people about AI. And here's the other secret. You've actually been using AI a lot longer than you realize. Because while ChatGPT put AI on front of everyone's mind, things like talk to text, things like autocomplete, the various searches you've probably been doing, the way that the mapping app sends you the fastest route on any given day, those are all also examples of AI. And the reason we need to remember that is when we start talking about regulating AI, we're not only talking about regulating ChatGPT or regulating, the kind of killer robot scenario. We're also talking about regulating your mapping app.
Hold on, Liz, let me ask you this, because you do have a JD, and obviously you spend a lot of time thinking about the law, and you're at Cato, which means that again, there's the protection of private property rights, including intellectual property. Where do you come down in this idea of how, publications and writing, how that feeds into the large language models of some of this AI? Where do you come in? How do you noodle this through, this balance between allowing these platforms, software, universes to expand, whereas they're not doing it at the expense of the innovation of other people?
Well, I will say, I do always joke that intellectual property is my third rail. It's the one thing in tech that I don't really get into, but I have had to think about it a little bit in this context. And the reason I don't get too deep into it is, as you mentioned, I kind of come at everything from a libertarian principles point of view, and there can be libertarian principles on both sides of the IP debate.
Of course.
There can be a libertarian principle that strongly favors fair use.
Hold on, I'm going to interrupt. If you ask a group of libertarians to define, like if you have, reason libertarians and objectivist libertarians and Cato libertarians to define libertarianism, you're going to get like a dozen answers, and so much for the non-aggression theory. Pretty soon they'll be winding up in fisticuffs. But go ahead.
I was going to say, so you can have a very kind of libertarian free market approach that strongly favors fair use, and you can have one that strongly favors the rights of the copyright holder or of the intellectual property holder. So that's why I've largely not engaged on this. But I do think it is important to consider this in the AI context, because this probably is one of the examples of a place where we're going to need legal clarity for innovation to continue. Both rights holders and development and AI developers are going to need to know what the appropriate bounds are, so that they can ensure that we've struck the balance that we as a society have determined is appropriate. It's probably not going to be either extreme, in my opinion. But I do think this is a good example of one of those places, and we saw this with the internet before, where there is likely to be a need for legal clarity around what the kind of bounds are.
I guess what I come back to, right, is we didn't need statute in order to solve the problem of digital sampling of music in hip hop. Right? We eventually just sort of the framework emerged. Again, it gets into the concept of spontaneous order here. Actually, we didn't, right? I'm saying this, never, I'm talking to a lawyer, never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. But we didn't need statute to sort of noodle that through, did we? They figured it out.
So it's complicated, and it depends on what we're talking about. So there are things like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that has to do with, exact copies being uploaded to the internet. And we have seen this potentially be abused at times, where people have used DMCA strikes against things that were clearly fair use to try and get things taken down off the internet. One of my favorites is there's a story about a panel in DMCA that got a DMCA strike against it over something that was played during the panel, and then decide to fight that. There are a lot of examples of
the
just
call
kind of,
is coming from inside the house.
Of just kind of like these like, you've got to be kidding me, and whatnot. And because of the liability requirements there, even if the claims turn out to be false, there usually is at least a brief moment where the content has to be taken down out of an abundance of caution. There's an important case called Google Books that was, again, about in the internet era, about what are the lines between fair use and copyright when it comes to the searchability of some of these materials and things like that. So that's what I mean when I say we will likely have to see some definition of contours. It won't necessarily be a this is always allowed and this isn't allowed. But if we kind of take the internet as an example, you'll likely see IP has traditionally been one of those areas where there has had to be some sort of legal clarity in some form during the use of this technology.
I get it. I understand, with the case against Google Books. I did like the idea and the ability when a quote from a book would come into my head and I would go and search it because I couldn't remember either where it was or, what the exact quote was, to be able to go there and see it. And now I can. As I said before we started recording, one of the things I like to do is to talk to folks about their outside interest. I think it humanizes the folks who are doing policy and political work in DC and elsewhere. So what are some of your outside interests when you're not doing this very weighty and important work on public policy? What are you up to?
So my main outside interests are probably fitness related, and especially distance running. I am a 12-time marathoner and a 6-time Boston qualifier. We're recording the day after the Boston Marathon. I won't lie, that's my Super Bowl event, so I definitely had it on in the background watching it. I've run it twice myself, and it's a very unique and special experience. And for those of you who caught that I went to Wellesley earlier and are runners, you know what that means, and that is that part of how I got into running is Wellesley famously cancels classes. It's the halfway point on the Boston Marathon, and all the women at Wellesley go out and form what's called the Scream Tunnel. We spend about 4 hours screaming at the top of our lungs. No one has any voices the next day.
Screaming in support, not screaming in anger. I just want to be really clear about this.
In this day and age, you might have to clarify that. Yes, screaming in support to cheer on the runners. It's a long-standing tradition. You can hear us from about half a mile away, and it's and so that was part of what inspired me to take up running. And then during the pandemic, I got a little more serious about it, as I think several of us did with our various hobbies. And so, like I said, that's a lot of my time, and it does actually relate to my work in some ways, because it's a great way to clear my head, or if I'm stuck on a research project or whatever, oftentimes going for a run will really help me figure out what I actually went to say or write.
It is amazing how, sort of you can detach and sort of let that part of your brain noodle these things through. I appreciate that. Jennifer, how do folks find out more about the good work that you're doing at Cato?
So you can find me on Twitter or X at JRHuddles. And you can also find my work on Cato's website, cato.org. And if you want to go directly to my page, it'll be cato.org/Jennifer Huddleston.
So check it out, Huddleston, Huddleston. Of course, I probably just butchered that, but in any case, Jennifer, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And this has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. As always, you can check us out on the many fine podcast platforms. Basically, wherever you get your podcasts, you're going to find the Lunch Hour. If you're listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, go and check us out on YouTube. See what's happening in studio. Subscribe, leave a comment, leave a like, and most importantly, let your friends and family members' friends know how much you are enjoying it. I am your host. I'm Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.